and welcome to Bloody Violent History. My name is Tom Ashton, and I'm here with my podcast buddy Jamie Jackson. And welcome back to our section on 100 bloody objects. And what object do you have for us today, Jamie?
Object number 17, Driftwood. Disastrous expeditions. Can do and seriously don't.
Well, I hope you've calibrated your compass and zeroed your altimeter, for we are about to set off on a journey of exploration. Anyone who has led any sort of life will have embarked on an expedition or two, some more hair-raising than others, but things can still go wrong. At centre parks, as they do paddling up the Limpopo or straddling Crib Goch wearing your grandpa's tweed suit and a pair of wellies. But in the field of human endeavour, there are some expeditions which end in a truly disastrous manner. Humans love to explore and set records on land, at the poles, at sea, and in space. And some of these are undertaken by the amateur who may be ill-prepared or subject to bad luck. So let's get in amongst the bodies dangling from mountains, frozen in ice or bobbing amongst the waves, awaiting a visit from Bruce. Jamie, summon the ghosts of Phileas Fogg and describe to me how often on expeditions reality bites.
Reality bites in many different ways, Tom, and for many different reasons. It can be stupidity, overreach, chutzpah, bad luck, poor equipment, you name it. But any expedition has its risks, and sometimes it ends with a hard landing. Friends of mine back in the 1950s when they were children used to use coin-operated binoculars to see the bodies hanging on ropes from the north face of the Eiger. This was a tourist attraction.
What lovely friends you have. Actually, I remember that was Wengen. We used to go take the children to Wengen. You could see the Eiger there. It was fantastic.
And bodies are so often left on mountainsides. I mean, there are over 200 bodies still left on Everest. And of course, there's Green Boots, suspected to be the Indian climber Pandra, who died in 1996. And his green boots were a marker for all expeditions going up the northeast face of Everest, the ridgeline, to get to the death zone. So these sort of markers, these waypoints, dot the entire planet. If you look at mountains like the Matterhorn, over 500 people have died climbing that. Over 60 people have died with the Eiger. So,
are you saying that their death is not entirely in vain?
I think you have to push forward. I mean, if you're on an expedition, you know there are risks and you know that it can end badly. Explorers and adventurers and navigators and cartographers, people like Captain James Cook, who was killed in 1779 in Hawaii. His men, of course, had taken 2 types of venereal disease to Hawaii, so I guess it was a kind of payback. But he tried to take a local chief hostage in order to get a stolen longboat back and was stabbed through the neck and then clubbed. And actually, I think one of his clubs is in the British Museum, one of the ones that hit him. So, this is what happens on expeditions.
Yes.
And some journeys are shorter than others.
And also some of these expedition leaders, they seem to be the kind of people who really need to die on the last day of battle going out in a blaze of bullets.
Or falling from the Eiffel Tower. If you think of someone like Franz Reichelt, who was the flying tailor, as he was known, who was an amateur parachutist, and he jumped 187 feet from the first stage of the Eiffel Tower in 1912 and plummeted to his death. And there's footage of people in top hats sort of measuring the crater he left. So you're always going to get these people. And as I said, sometimes it's bad equipment, sometimes it's bad luck, sometimes it's just poor judgment.
So balloons came first, but at the turn of the 20th century, aeroplanes made their appearance, and maybe it wasn't climbers, but people who liked being up in the air suddenly had a whole new part of the world they could explore. Who do you want to start with, Jamie?
I think it's worth starting with Amelia Earhart, actually. She was such a pioneer and certainly the first female to cross the Atlantic.
And she looked damn cool.
She looked damn cool. She did some amazing things, and I always think that flying Eleanor Roosevelt after a dinner party at the White House around Washington D.C.
Do you think the loop
in a light
kept the
aircraft
cheese souffle down?
in their evening dresses and fur coats, that's quite classy. But she took off in 1937 to circumnavigate the globe with her navigator Fred Noonan, and they disappeared. They refueled in New Guinea. They had done 22,000 miles, but then they vanished. And it's always been open to speculation and conspiracy theories. Some people say that they landed several hundred miles south on another island and were castaways for a while before dying from starvation. Some people say they were taken captive by the Japanese. Some people say they just crashed into the sea, which is actually the most likely. And communications were so poor in those days, quite apart from the technology, it was so basic. So if you had a fault, if you had a problem in midair, you were probably going to crash.
Yeah, I mean, they had things like, single ignition systems, and if that went wrong, there was no backup.
Completely, and you were always going to have problems with rough weather and that sort of thing, and it was very difficult to navigate when there were very few locations to triangulate on. So that was poor old Amelia Earhart.
I think my grandfather, between the wars, flying probably in India, where they had very ropey aeroplanes, and on one occasion his propeller came off. He used to tell us this story when we were little. And so, the only thing he could do was land wherever he was and then try and get a message back to his base to bring him another propeller because it had gone flinging off. And he was waiting there for a while, and it went on and on. So he thought, well, he needed to go to the loo. So he went round the back of a bush, and sure enough, there was his propeller. Bolted it back on and went home.
It was very make do and can do, and that really is what marks out these pioneers. And even into the sort of 20th century, you look someone like Richard Branson and his Virgin Atlantic Flyer, the balloon trip across the Atlantic with Per Lindstrand, where he sort of touched the water near Ireland. It ended up in the water for about 2 hours. They both thought the other was dead. But it was an extraordinary flight, and these are the people who sort of push the boundaries. And you take someone like Steve Fossett, who was also an extraordinary pioneer in flying and both balloons and in aircraft. In 2002, he took the Spirit of Freedom balloon and circumnavigated the globe in it. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. I think it took 13 days, 8 hours, but that was an extraordinary trip. In 2005, he followed up with the Virgin Atlantic Global Flyer, which sounds like a sort of a ticket offer plugging the Virgin brand. But this was the first unrefueled circumnavigation of the globe in an aircraft, and he took about 67 hours. And again, an extraordinary trip. But like so many of the adventurers, it's later on that things went wrong, and something so prosaic as just going on a light aircraft from his ranch in Nevada, and he crashed in California, in the highlands, and his body wasn't actually found. This is in the middle of America. His body and the crash site weren't found for 13 months. Yeah. So it says a lot about how difficult it is to find the remains. But this is what happens with so many.
The same guy who was trying to find the Chinese balloon floating over America.
Yeah, I mean, they spotted that a few times and never brought that down. But balloons tend to have bad endings.
Yeah.
You can go back to the pioneers of ballooning, long-distance ballooning, 1897, and the S.A. Andre, Salomon Andre, the physicist and adventurer and balloonist, who took a hydrogen balloon with two others and was attempting, this was backed by the Swedish government and the Swedish royal family, great fanfare, and he took off, just like Phileas Fogg, you mentioned in your introduction. And this was a hydrogen balloon. He thought he could steer it with drag ropes. He thought it would be a 30-day trip, sailing across to Russia in this hydrogen balloon. It arrived from France, where it had been built. It was already leaking, but he took off, didn't really prepare. And some say it crashed after 10 hours, some say 2 days, but it took them 3 months trying to trudge back across the shifting Arctic ice, the ice floes, and shooting polar bears and eating them. And they think that that's what killed all 3 of them eventually, catching botulinum from the polar bears they were eating.
And the toxic polar bear liver.
The toxic polar bear liver, or from parasites. I mean, the whole thing was a complete catastrophe. And no one found their bodies for 33 years. It wasn't until 1930 that a scientific expedition stumbled upon their remains, their sort of mummified remains and their campsite. But it was a pretty dismal end. But again, this is what happens time and again. And quite often, just as the hydrogen balloon leaked, so often it's that early technology that lets you down. And we'll talk about Scott's Antarctic expedition. And that was let down in many ways by having motorized sledges and not having the engineers there or the mechanics there to help keep them going or to deal with them in that sort of cold environment. It's the technology as well as the overreach that lets these expeditions down.
And it seems that often the difference, the margin between success and failure is if the person involved, particularly the leader, is going to dot every I and cross every T, take as much care as possible, given the likelihood of all the things that could go wrong, to mitigate those things. And, I mean, we've talked about airmen in the First World War. The ones that tended to survive were the ones who took a keen interest in how their aircraft were actually put together and maintained, and spoke to their engineers and knew as much as possible, because it was a high-risk endeavour, and you could reduce the chances of failure by a small amount if you at least took as much care as you possibly could.
And really think about the environment in which they're operating. It's no coincidence that Amundsen got to the South Pole successfully and survived, brought his men back.
Well, he trained for 3 years or something.
He certainly trained for 3 years and trained on skis, which is something that Scott's lot never did. Scott was wearing wool. Amundsen's lot wore furs. I mean, we'll talk about this later, but you can sort of see the difference. And you come to the present day, you look at Arctic warfare vehicles. You look at the US Army. They've just ordered a new cold weather all-terrain vehicle. What do they order? They order the Swedish Hägglund CVS-10, or a derivative of it, the unarmoured Beowulf.
Well, on the basis that the Swedes know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing, and they've trialled this, tested it. It's been used by commando forces and forces operating in the Arctic for years. And so they, of course, are going to have the best technology. So you can see all the way through history, it's the people who know the region, know the technology, know how to apply that technology and train for it, that are going to have the best chance of succeeding.
You couldn't say that it was an expedition as such, but there was a rather remarkable story at the beginning of the Second World War when one of Hitler's very close henchmen, Rudolf Hess, decided to hop into a Messerschmitt and fly to Britain.
Yes, Rudolf Hess was deputy Führer, and this again, the reason it's worth bringing in, because it's about someone who doesn't understand the situation. I mean, he was later diagnosed by psychiatrists as being schizoid and paranoid and essentially bonkers.
A loon.
Yeah. And he didn't really know what he was flying into. He set off in this Messerschmitt.
Apart from your pun.
But he set off in his Messerschmitt, parachuted into an area south of Glasgow, thinking he could meet the Duke of Hamilton, that he believed was running a sort of anti-Churchill, pro-Nazi, or at least pro-peace coalition in Britain. And he just misread the situation and then spent the next 46 years or so incarcerated, most of it in Spandau jail. He actually spent 4 days in the Tower of London as well. But this is what happens if you don't understand the environment in which you're heading into. And so it's worth bringing someone like Rudolf Hess in. It's because it's part of the same strand of amateurism, if you like, of putting your own beliefs ahead of reality
and being carried on by a hopeless idea.
Yes. So I think it's worth putting him in as
Tipping
a
our hat.
disastrous expedition.
Yeah. And perhaps Charles Lindbergh gets a mention too.
Well, he gets a mention because of really what happened to his baby and the kidnap and murder of his child. Because so often with these adventurers, with these explorers, with these aviators, it's the life afterwards that is unhappy, that doesn't reach the heights that they reached, and that the fame and fortune.
He was enormously famous.
He was enormously famous. I mean, if you look at the accolades and plaudits he won and the adulation he gained going around America after his trip across the Atlantic in the Spirit of St. Louis, you can see that this is, it was real fame. It was real celebrity. But the horrors of it, the sort of blowback from it, and the sort of pain of what happened after the kidnap and murder of his child, and the execution of the man who took the child and murdered him, you can see that reality is often very different.
And that's why they should probably go out in a hail of bullets.
Yeah, maybe that is the answer.
Seated one day at the tom-tom, I heard a welcome shout from the kitchen. Come and get it. A roast leg of insurance salesman. A chorus of yums ran round the table. Yum, 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 yum. Except for Junior, who pushed away his shell, got up from his log, and said,
I don't want any part of it.
What? Why not?
I don't eat people.
Hey?
I won't eat people.
Huh?
I don't eat people.
I must be going deaf.
Eating people is wrong.
It's wrong.
Don't eat people.
You've gone clean out of your mind.
I won't eat people.
What's the matter with the lad?
Don't eat people.
He keeps on repeating, eating people is bad.
And sometimes, Jamie, expeditions go so disastrously wrong that the people on the expedition end up being cooked by cannibals. And at this stage, I am not going to tell my story about the cannibals who eat the Englishman, the Frenchman, and the New Yorker, and turn their bodies into canoes. And nor am I going to sing Flanders and Swan's song, I won't eat people because eating people is wrong, as they tuck into a roast leg of insurance salesman. But
Can I go straight to the punchline where the New Yorker stabs himself with a fork and goes, "Sod your canoes."
Yeah, no, you ruined it. Nobody will ever hear that story properly told now.
No.
But we have a little something from my favourite Frenchman, Michel Montaigne, towards the end of this section. Meanwhile, Jamie, where did cannibalism take place?
Well, cannibalism is worth mentioning because, as you say, so many of these expeditions ran into cannibals or had to resort to cannibalism themselves in order to survive. But cannibalism as a whole was prevalent throughout the world, in many areas of the world. Not really for just eating, but so often it had a ritualistic aspect to it, whether it was to humiliate the enemy or to gain the strength of the enemy or to acquire the spirit of the enemy. There were so many different aspects, and quite often a sort of religious aspect to it. And you can go back to the 1520s when the Aztecs attacked a group of conquistadors and ended up, there is archaeological evidence for this, eating several hundred Spaniards and the locals who were travelling with them. And as we know, the Aztecs in battle tended to use swords edged with obsidian, volcanic glass, so they could wound the enemy and capture them rather than kill them, because they wanted them alive, so they could perform human sacrifice. And I've seen the box in which the Aztecs put the human hearts, the still beating hearts. So eating part of your enemy was pretty prevalent. So whether you go to New Zealand and the Maoris, that seems to have been airbrushed out of history, the fact that the Maoris practiced cannibalism. You look at the Iroquoian tribes in America, certainly groups like the Mohawks practiced cannibalism. During the Jamestown settlement, the establishment of that from 1607, there were certainly cannibal tribes across the falls, further up the Jamestown River.
But the settlers themselves tucked into each other.
They certainly did. This is what we've talked about. Well, this is what we've mentioned, is that if it goes badly wrong, then cannibalism starts creeping in. And yes, the Jamestown settlers, certainly in that terrible winter of 1609, 1610, they were certainly resorting to cannibalism. And in terms of disastrous expeditions, you can see the first resupply from England in the Sea Venture ship. That crashed into rocks off Bermuda, and they ended up being stranded there. But they turned tragedy and disaster into triumph by cannibalizing that ship, using local wood, building 2 more ships and sailing on to Bermuda.
Meanwhile,
with
having a
supplies.
big row with each other at the same time.
Yeah, that's human nature, isn't it? Yes, they ended up setting up rival camps on different sides of the island, different ends of the beach. So this is what happens on expeditions.
But back to the Maoris you mentioned in 1809. What went on? What happened there?
Well, there was a ship called the Boyd that was picking up timber, and they were attacked by Maoris. And there's certainly strong evidence that there was cannibalism practiced on the survivors. And again, there was a ritualistic aspect to it. There is this sort of cooking your enemy and making them know what's going to happen to them that was prevalent in many parts of the world. Right up into the 20th century, you had the Leopard Society across swathes of Africa, starting in places like Sierra Leone, Liberia, and spreading outwards from there, where capturing, killing, and eating other humans was part of the ritual, part of their practice.
And the image we have of the missionary being cooked up for dinner is that he's sitting in a pot, which seems rather strange given that some of these tribes wouldn't be able to make such a thing. But it turns out that it's possibly the whalers that were all over the world harpooning whales and then rendering down their bodies for oil and so on, that it would have been their pots which had been sold.
And quite often, captives were roasted rather than boiled. If you take 1867, Thomas Baker, the Methodist missionary in Fiji, there was an altercation over a comb, and he wanted the comb back from a tribal chief. So he had his head stove in with a rock, and he ended up being roasted. And actually, I think he ended up in a pot too, because they still have his boot leather on display in Suva, and the rock that caved his head in. So this was going on. You didn't want to be a lone missionary. Actually, he had 7 Fijians with him who were also killed. But you didn't want to be a missionary in far-flung corners of the world and fall out with the locals, because this is what could happen to you.
And it's a theme throughout this talk of these disastrous expeditions that, unfortunately, when you come a cropper and your expedition sort of grinds to a halt, somebody tries to eat you, do you, or do something particularly unspeakable to you as the sort of final throw of the dice.
Well, it is sort of Lord of the Flies, isn't it?
Yes.
Actually, I remember when I was at law school, there was a law about cannibalism, but it wasn't illegal. But actually, what was illegal was murdering someone in order to eat them.
Okay, so if you found them, you could eat them up.
Yeah, I don't think there was a law. I'll have to check on whether that law has been changed. But
do you think if you get a note from the person you're going to eat, saying "I don't mind," that's okay?
Yeah, I think there was that.
Please eat me.
Wasn't that case in Germany of someone who volunteered to be eaten? I mean, that was pretty recent.
It's very German.
Yeah, I'm saying nothing.
You're saying, I know, well, you've got lots of German blood coursing through your great veins, haven't you?
But you go on to the terrible air crash in the Andes in 1972.
Yeah, that was the Uruguayan Air Force flight, which was chartered to take 45 people. And it was known as the Miracle of the Andes, 40 people plus 5 crew. And the inexperienced pilot made a mistake and managed to hit the top of a mountain on his way to come down to an altitude to land. So they ended up actually in Andes in Argentina. And they had a terrible time of it. I mean, it was made into a quite well-known film called Alive. But they had quite a lot of casualties. So there were 12 that were killed at the start. But then halfway through their experience, there was an avalanche, which then killed as much again, and they ended up with 29 fatalities. And essentially, there was just no food. They had very little food on the plane, and so they could never get their energy levels up to scramble over the mountains to help. So eventually 2 of the passengers, they had a rugby team as the passengers, the Old Christians Club rugby union team from Montevideo. So hopefully 1 or 2 of those boys were quite fit to start with, but a couple of them managed to scramble over the mountains and get help. And then they did that because they had eaten some of the flesh of the dead passengers.
Well, and the survivors, there were 16 survivors. They survived for 72 days. And it just goes to show that they wouldn't have survived had they been vegan or vegetarian. So there is a lesson in that.
Do you think Darwin strikes again?
I think Darwin does strike again. I don't think they would have been able to get over the mountain or survive.
You can't get rid of them. They probably would have survived. They'd have been the last one sucking on a weed.
On a lentil.
Chewing on a lentil.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
But it just shows that in extremis, humans will turn to anything in order to get through. And
it came out initially, there was a sort of shock horror, and people were, having been thrilled to find them alive, they then got some quite bad press. But eventually, when they examined the evidence, it was seen that the passengers who then died had actually given them a sort of the okay that if they did die, that it was all right to eat them.
Yes,
I'm about to break into Flanders and Swan.
but I think what caused the outcry was the photograph of a half-eaten human leg in the Chilean press. That seemed to set it off.
It reminds me of that episode when we were talking about
the true dogs of war.
The true dogs of war, when the British general had his leg damaged, and so it was chopped off, and he happened to have a pet lion. And they was going to feed it to Poilu as rations, but they decided it was a bad idea.
Yeah, he'd become a man-eater. So that's the thing. People get a taste for it.
This is an extract from Michel de Montaigne's 16th century essay of Cannibals. They have their wars with the nations beyond the mountains, further inland, to which they go quite naked, with no other arms than bows or wooden swords ending in a sharp point, in the manner of the tongues of our boar spears. It is astonishing what firmness they show in their combats, which never end but in slaughter and bloodshed, for as to rout and terror, they know nothing of either. Each man brings back as his trophy the head of the enemy he has killed, and sets it up at the entrance to his dwelling. After they have treated their prisoners well for a long time with all the hospitality they can think of, each man who has a prisoner calls a great assembly of his acquaintances. He ties a rope to one of the prisoner's arms, by the end of which he holds him a few steps away for fear of being hurt, and gives his dearest friend the other arm to hold in the same way, and these two, in the presence of the whole assembly, kill him with their swords. This done, they roast him and eat him in common, and send some pieces to their absent friends. This is not, as people think, for nourishment, as of the old Scythians used to do. It is to betoken an extreme revenge. And the proof of this came when they saw the Portuguese, who had joined forces with their adversaries, inflict a different kind of death on them when they took them prisoner, which was to bury them up to the waist, shoot the rest of their body full of arrows, and afterward hang them. They thought that these people from the other world, being men who had sown the knowledge of many vices among their neighbours, and were much greater masters than themselves of every sort of wickedness, did not adopt this sort of vengeance without some reason, and that it must be more painful than their own, so they began to give up their old method and to follow this one. I am not sorry that we notice the barbarous horror of such acts, but I am heartily sorry that, judging their faults rightly, we should be so blind to our own. I think there is more barbarity in eating a man alive than in eating him dead, and in tearing by tortures the rack of a body still full of feeling, in roasting a man bit by bit, in having him bitten and mangled by dogs and swine, as we have not only read but seen within fresh memory, not among ancient enemies but among neighbours and fellow citizens, and what is worse, on the pretext of piety and religion, than in roasting him and eating him after he is dead.
There have been a number of expeditions to the North and South Pole, and they tend to become quite famous. Of course, Captain Scott being perhaps one of the most famous for young British enthusiasts. So perhaps we should start with the Scott expedition.
Yes, Captain Scott, always played by Kenneth More, of course.
Yes,
He
well, he's
played
got a great
every
head of hair.
Yeah, every
Important.
British hero from
Douglas
Captain
Bader.
Scott, Douglas Bader, you name it. But the Scott expedition always stands out, not only for its heroism, but also for the miscalculations that could be made. And we mentioned this earlier. There's the rivalry between Scott and Amundsen and the different approaches to the expeditions. The fact that Amundsen took 4 men and Scott took 5 men, that Scott had science on his mind when he went on it. They were collecting rock samples. Amundsen just wanted to get to the South Pole. That was his key reason for training for 3 years, for
his
training
mission.
on skis. Yeah, he had a single goal, and that's one thing that often defines expeditions. If you have a known goal, and I think the amateurism, we talked about this in our podcast on what was it, the stiff upper lip, and you could see that with Scott. I mean, they were incredibly heroic, incredibly brave, but it was flawed from the start. The fact that he didn't want to take dogs because he had had bad experiences looking after them, feeding them on previous expeditions. He took horses, but the horses didn't have snowshoes, so they were a disaster as well. The motorised sledges were a disaster.
He had the wrong clothes.
He had the wrong clothes.
He couldn't ski.
The fuel was leaked out. They didn't place their caches of food sensibly. So everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And we know the outcome. We know that they eventually made it to the South Pole and realised that Amundsen, the black flag, was flying there. Amundsen had got there first. It was a catastrophe, and Amundsen was so much better prepared for that expedition. But there were other expeditions at the same time. You look at the Australasian Antarctic expedition, again, a scientific expedition led by Douglas Mawson. The successes really came years later when the scientific data was sort of processed and what they had achieved was really appreciated.
But they weren't trying to get to a specific point. They were trying to do mapping and examine those bits of the Antarctic that faced up towards Australia.
Yes, they were mapping the coastline. They managed to travel about 2,500 miles, but right from the start there were problems. I mean, Ninnis, one of the team members, he fell down a crevasse, and he was carrying the sledge with the tent and the food. So they were left with no food. The other 2 members, the 3 of them, didn't have any food, didn't have any shelter. They tried to shelter under a sledge. The second member of the expedition, Mertz, he died from disease and illness, and it was just Mawson himself who was left, and he suffered from snow blindness. But he still managed to trudge back 5 miles a day and get back to camp, by which time his ship had left, and he was left with 6 members of the relief crew for another year. So he had a most terrible time on that expedition.
He didn't resort to cannibalism, but they did eat their dogs, didn't they?
They did. In the
I
same
think the
way,
dogs quite often got eaten.
They did. 2 of the dogs had gone down the crevasse with Ninnis, of course. But Amundsen ate his dogs. It's one of the reasons they took those animals. It was a food resource as well as something to pull the sledges.
Maggie's not in here, so it's all right.
Yes, cover her ears. But these are the sorts of things that can go wrong with an expedition. And you look at the Shackleton expedition, the Imperial expedition of 1914, and although they survived, he got all his men back in the end. It was an extraordinarily dangerous situation. I mean, the fact that his ship Endurance sank, the fact that he and whaling boats ended up on Elephant Island, the fact that he took one of the lifeboats, one of the longboats, 20 feet long, with 5 of them in this boat, including the carpenter that he had had a row with. It was an amazing feat to get 720 miles across that southern Antarctic Ocean. I mean, incredible. 15 days in an open boat, going through storms that had actually sunk a freighter coming from Argentina to South Georgia, and yet he survived. And then they landed, and he managed to take 2 of his companions across the mountains to the other side of South Georgia on this extraordinary 36-hour trip. 32 miles he covered. And they put nails in their boots. They had one length of rope, and they still managed to do it.
Yeah, 50 foot of rope.
Yeah, amazing. And I mean, you think of how the SAS got stranded on South Georgia when their helicopters crashed, when they were hit by a blizzard. These are the sort of conditions that Shackleton faced, and that was after 15 days in an open boat. So it was incredible, the hardiness of these people, and it's ironic and sad that years later Shackleton died on South Georgia from a heart attack in his 40s.
He put a lot of mileage on his body.
A lot of mileage and a lot of alcohol.
What did his doctor told him he should give up the booze, and he said, the usual argument, you're trying to ruin my life, make it miserable.
Everyone of that generation. I mean, if you didn't start the day with a brandy,
you'd need to.
Yeah,
but the explorer Duncan Cass in 1955 travelled the same route, and I mean he was astonished by what they'd achieved and said, "I don't know how they did it, except that they had to. 3 men of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration with 50 foot of rope between them."
And a carpenter's adze. I mean, it's the improvisation that's amazing. Yeah. They really turned their hand to anything. So that was the golden age, but also the most tragic age of Antarctic exploration.
And 1916, it's in the middle of the war, so the focus is not really on them. And those men finally returned back to Britain, didn't they?
They did, and I think 3 were killed in the Great War, 5 were wounded. So it wasn't the end of the story, and we mentioned this, what happens to so many of these explorers. What happens next is really a sad epilogue to their life of adventure.
There are many places to come unstuck on your expedition, and 2 favourites are deserts and jungles.
Yeah, less so with deserts, because you don't tend to try and traverse a desert on your own. You need backup or a camel train to get you through. It's no accident that Arab cameleers used to basically shelter inside the carcasses of dead camels, and that was always a very useful shelter on those trips. And you tended to go from oasis to oasis. So yes, you do get disappearances like the Chinese biologist who disappeared near Lop Nor in 1980 looking for water, but these are quite rare because people tend to stray from their campsites in which they're staying. They don't tend to go out on their own into the desert.
They can still be an epic. I mean, the Lawrence of Arabia attack, where he had to cross the Great Desert.
Yes, whether you're crossing the Sinai or elsewhere, or the Great Depression, or you're operating in warfare, yes, it can be a very unforgiving environment. But you don't tend to explore because there are very few places to reach. It's not like going for the summit of a mountain. So, mind you, what that Chinese biologist found in Lop Nor, given that I think that's where the Chinese do a lot of their nuclear tests, he might have fallen into a large hole created by an underground nuclear test.
Well, jungles, of course, they're places to explore and get lost and come a cropper.
Yes, and people have been exploring. I mean, if you look at the Elizabethan era, for example, I mean, there were people looking for El Dorado, so there were always expeditions. If you look at the conquistadors going in throughout Latin America, they were going into the hinterland and sometimes coming a cropper. I mean, right up to, say, 1925, you had someone like Percy Fawcett going with his son and another friend and heading into the sort of wilderness of Brazil to try and find what he thought would be the hidden city, the secret city, the magical city of Zed, or Z for our American listeners. So people are always drawn to these areas, these unexplored areas, or finding the Amazon. I mean, look at
Also, with Fawcett's expedition, he gave fairly clear instructions for people to not come looking for him.
And yet a lot of people did go looking for him.
And some died in the process.
They certainly did. And if you look at the local tribes, they all told stories that they had either seen Fawcett, or he was going into an area where there was an aggressive tribe who would kill them. And they were very territorial. And certainly along the east coast of Brazil, as we mentioned earlier, there were a lot of cannibal tribes there as well. But this exploration into jungle, along rivers, it's always been there. You look at Blashford Snell and his expeditions. There was a friend of mine who was going along a tributary of the Nile that hadn't really been explored. He was shot at by local tribesmen and paddled quickly away.
Blashford Snell was in Belize when I was posted there in the mid-'80s. We occasionally had to pluck them out of somewhere because they got a bit stuck. Towards the end of my time there, I was sent to the north of the country, where it was a bit more open, and told to go on a patrol in Land Rovers, which was sheer luxury because normally we were on foot. And so I was given a couple of Land Rovers, radios and rations, and set off towards the border with Guatemala. And there was on my map a track marked from the south part of where we arrived on the border up to the north, where there was farming land. So I thought, well, we'll have a crack at that, even though I'd been told not to do it because it was impassable. Anyway, several days later, I was firmly lost in the jungle, and we had slightly run out by then of rations. So we had this balloon that we filled with helium and would raise above the canopy, and then the helicopters could fly us in extra rations where the balloon is. But we were so far off course, they couldn't even see our balloon floating from the canopy.
It is very, very difficult to know your location in the jungle. It's navigating in the jungle is one of the most challenging things.
Yeah. Well, there was no GPS, and we were eventually, our Land Rovers were almost completely destroyed by the end of the week, as we had to sort of bounce along the track by aiming for trees and bouncing off them onto the next bit of the track. Eventually we got almost to the top, and I went on foot to find some Mennonite farmers who we thought were up there, and sure enough we found one with a tractor. So we pulled our two completely destroyed Land Rovers into the Grenadiers' camp behind the Mennonite tractor, and I was very pleased with my amazing expedition, but I wasn't greeted with any kind of applause.
But a tractor, I thought they were against all those sort of things. Or
No, the Mennonites are slightly less they're slightly less extreme.
Oh, really?
I think, than the Amish.
They embrace technology.
Certain amount of it, but they still,
Yeah. So you didn't end up being called Plank Maker Tom.
Certainly not. Hero of the jungle, Tom.
Barn Builder Tom. But all these locations, they attract adventure, they attract discovery and exploration, and mountains have always been there. I mean, we all know the comment by George Mallory because it's there. and that's what killed him in 1924.
Do you think one of the reasons why there are quite a lot of Brits who like doing this is because we don't really have serious mountains in this country, so we have to go and conquer other people's?
Partly, and a lot of the people, that great era of exploration from the sort of early 20th century, and certainly after the Great War, a lot of them had been in the Great War, so they were looking for a bit of adventure. I mean, nothing could beat the horrors of the Western Front, so they decided, let's go on and explore. And it certainly explains the sort of approach of people like Percy Fawcett, for example, and probably George Mallory, who had also been in the Great War.
There's a description in Robert Graves' book, Goodbye to All That. He was a friend of Mallory's and was climbing, I think, in Snowdon with him. And they got to the bottom of whatever bit it was they were climbing, and Mallory had left something of his, like his wallet, at the top. So he said, well, just wait here and I'll just go and get it. And he just scrabbled up the slope and then came back down with whatever it was he'd forgotten. And Graves said that later on, when the weather had cleared, he went back to look at that bit, and it was a sort of sheer cliff. And Mallory had the reputation for being a sort of magical climber. He could do things that others really couldn't.
But I mean, climbers are a particular breed. I mean, I know several climbers who don't have any toes. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, even on my Outward Bound course, the guy was very proudly had no toes.
Yeah,
it's like a sort of
badge of honour.
Badge of honour.
Yeah, you haven't been to the extremes if you've still got all your digits, basically, or your toes. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. But you know, if you think that it took 75 years to find Mallory's body, it just shows that the wilderness, the inaccessibility of these mountain passes, these mountain climbs.
Yeah. And I mean, the Matterhorn, the glacier on the side of the Matterhorn throws out climbers that have been lost decades before at the top, and then they're taken down by the ice. And even heard of stories of old ladies having to go and identify their husbands who look sort of 21 years old.
We move forward to 1936 and that terrible episode on the north face of the Eiger when 5 climbers were killed. One had been killed training, and then Andreas Hinterstoicer, the famous climber. He was only 21, but you know, they named the Hinterstoicer Traverse after him because he was such an extraordinary figure, a great climber. But this was summer climbing, and the real killer on the north face of the Eiger, as it so often is with mountain climbing, is rockfall. I mean, that is the real problem. And they were ascending the north face, and they were hit by an avalanche of rocks. And Hinterstoicer was swept off. He was dealing with the ropes at the time, so he wasn't roped up to the others. And if you look at the other 3, what happened to them? One slammed into the rock, was killed. The one at the top, he asphyxiated from the weight of everyone else below him. And the guy in the middle, the guide, Tony Kurtz, he took a day to die from cold, and they tried to. There were those who tried to rescue him, pass a rope to him, but he simply couldn't thread it through. He couldn't. The
carabiner.
He couldn't lower himself down or do anything, and he just said, "I can go no further," and died. And it took several weeks to bring those bodies down, but at least they were brought down. But it just shows the risks that occur in those sort of climbing accidents. And you're always hearing the mountain accidents. You're always hearing people pushing themselves to the limit. And it's often bad luck rather than poor preparation that gets them in the end.
There have, of course, been many expeditions at sea because people are always wanting to know what's over the horizon. And that includes the Atlantic.
And ghost ships and stories of unknown vessels that are sighted.
Triangle.
Yeah, it's like all these other places, or all these places that were unexplored, or stories of dragons or sea monsters. You're always going to get maps drawn with sea monsters, for example. The unknown has always been fascinating for people, and the sea is one of them. And there's always that legend, maybe a myth, that in the early 14th century, the Sultan of Mali sent 200 ships out across the Atlantic, and one ship came back and talked of this stream, maybe the Gulf Stream, that carried all the other ships away. So he ended up sending 2,000 ships off. But you have to wonder, if you were sultan of a nation or of a tribe or a people who weren't ocean traders, who simply pottered along the coast trading, would you really send fleets out into the vastness of the ocean? And the answer is probably not. And you look at what happened to boats later on, ships later on. They didn't fare particularly well. We talked about the Sea Venture going out to resupply the Jamestown settlement in the early 17th century. When they hit a storm and the seams started coming apart, they were caulking it with slabs of meat. And you look at the longboat of Shackleton's expedition, he was using seal blood to try and make it waterproof, try and seal the seams. So there was a lot of improvisation, and there was always scope for disaster just round the corner.
And a very famous expedition, of course, was that of Captain Sir John Franklin and his navigation of the Northwest Passage above Canada.
That was a disastrous expedition, but very Victorian in what it hoped to achieve. The fact that they got stuck in the ice in the Victoria Straits near King William Island, were there for a year. John Franklin died from pneumonia, and his subordinate basically tried to get the rest of the crew, what remained of the 129 originals, across the frozen vastness to Canada to save his men. And they found corpses since that have been mummified, and they had a terrible time. Like those other expeditions we talked about, there is proof of cannibalism. There's certainly proof of starvation. They think that everything from dysentery to pneumonia...
Polar bears again.
Polar bears. There were all sorts of ones. It's even been said that the men died from lead poisoning from the cans of food that they had originally before the food ran out. So it was a most terrible expedition and one of the great disasters. And they have found the wrecks since of the Erebus and the Terror. Also terrible names for ships that are going on an expedition.
About giving yourself a very bad chance. Unlucky name.
It doesn't help. And you would have thought that seafarers were fairly superstitious and they wouldn't choose those names, the god of the underworld and the name Terror. So, and they certainly had a horrendous time before they died. It was just ghastly. I mean, exposure, cold, starvation, disease, you name it, they suffered from it and they died. And that is what happens when a expedition goes horribly wrong.
Dun, 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 dun. Anyone who was a small boy in the 80s, or the 70s actually, would have seen the movie Jaws. And halfway through, there's a great solemn moment where Quint, was he called, recalls his time on the USS Indianapolis.
Yes, I think you have a family connection to Jaws.
Do a shout out to my son-in-law's father, who was the other policeman in the film Jaws. So
there you go.
There you go. Hi, Jeffrey. I hope you're listening to this. We want a review. I was meant to say, actually, that this is meant to be a commercial break. Please can we have a review, and remember to pass these podcasts on to your friends so that we can expand our listener base.
Yes.
Right, onwards with the USS Indianapolis.
Thanks for identifying the music, Tom, because I didn't actually recognise it.
I'm going to put it under this whole section.
But the USS Indianapolis, it's a well-known story, but it's worth mentioning it because it's the greatest single loss of life in the US Navy in its history. And out of 1,195 crewmen on board, by the end, only 316 were pulled out of the water. They had spent 3 or 4 days in the water. Many of them had 300 died as soon as the ship went down. It sank very quickly in minutes. They had the most appalling ordeal. a lot went mad. They got saltwater poisoning. The ones who did go insane while going through this, they were floated off, and in a way used as decoys, because 150 were then attacked by tiger sharks and oceanic white-tip sharks. And oddly enough, you very rarely get oceanic white-tip sharks these days. They're very, very rare, but they were far more common, far more plentiful back then.
Do you think the US Navy has been
Secretly
taking
killing
it out on them ever since?
Yeah, I don't blame them. I mean, it was the most terrible ordeal. And to have 150 men killed by sharks, when you're clinging on, when you're desperate to get on board the flotsam of the ship that had gone down, that was a terrible ordeal. And that ship, the reason we're calling it an expedition, a disastrous expedition, it was on a very secret mission, which is why no one really knew that the ship was in the area. It was sunk in the Philippine Sea, having taken uranium, the main supply of America's uranium, to the island of Tinian, the Tinian Air Base there, where the Little Boy bomb was being assembled to be dropped on Hiroshima. So that was the mission. That was the secret mission. And it did go horribly wrong. It was sunk by a Japanese sub, and the consequences are known. But it was such an ordeal, such a desperate situation, that it's worth mentioning in this podcast and in this section. It was definitely a terrible maritime disaster, an expedition that went wrong.
And the tragedies can be reflected in smaller scale disastrous expeditions. And a good example perhaps of that is Donald Crowhurst in 1968.
Yeah, and certainly there's a psychological dimension to this. I mean, on some of those Antarctic expeditions, there were people who had breakdowns whilst on those expeditions. And this is one of the problems. I mean, this is one of the problems Shackleton had to face with a member of his expedition. So you've always got those problems. And certainly if you're a solo yachtsman doing a round-the-world race, quite often you're driven by the same sort of urges that propel mountaineers, climbers, to do solo expeditions. And if you're badly prepared or luck is against you, then things go badly wrong, and you grasp for anything that's going to get you out of that situation. And Crowhurst, having set off on this global round-the-world yacht challenge, he was in a boat, the Tynemouth Electron, that simply was inadequate for the task. I mean, this was a trip, a race that was supposed to take the boats, south past the Cape of Good Hope, across the Pacific, and then round Cape Horn, back across the Atlantic. And it was very arduous. And what happened is that someone like Crowhurst, who had money problems, who had an inadequate boat, he was taking on water. He realised his boat wasn't up to the challenge, was falling behind. So what did he do? He pretended that he was still in the race and was transmitting back fake locations. Of course, there was no GPS in those days. It was very difficult to track boats. So he was just going round and round the Atlantic, pretending that he was in the race. But of course, one of the yachts sort of fell out of the race, and it put him in the lead. So he was in an even more tricky situation, and he was going to be found out. So in the end, after many months, he disappeared over the side of his boat. And that was the end of Crowhurst. And his boat apparently is lodged on sand dunes, is rotting away in the Cayman Islands. It was used for a while as a diving vessel in the Cayman Islands and has just been beached and is falling to pieces. But it's one of those sad artifacts, no different to finding the small amount of artifacts on Mallory's body or scattered around other expeditions that have gone horribly wrong, like the Northwest Passage, the Franklin expedition. This was just another item, another sort of bit of driftwood, if you like, that summarises the disastrous expeditions of history. And
he was competing with some of the very top sailors, handed sailors at the time, Robin Knox Johnson, Che Blythe. So
they were all household names.
Yeah.
And Crowhurst in a way became a household name because of because of the disaster, and again
the Eddie the Eagle of the seas.
Yes, and again it's the mystery around these expeditions that so often creates the conspiracy theories. What happened to Amelia Earhart? What happened to Crowhurst? What happened to Percy Fawcett? There are always going to be questions, and you're always going to get the sort of left field lot who always say they were abducted by aliens or experimented on by Martians. This is what tends to happen where there's an information gap.
Well, excellent. That leads us neatly onto our final section, outer space. Get your probes ready.
Well, indeed. And space, again, because it's always been considered the final frontier.
The last gasp.
The last gasp. You are going to get technical failure, and this is one of the problems, whether it's launching a satellite or launching astronauts. There is a huge capacity for problems, for things falling back to Earth and things going horribly wrong, particularly if they're testing the edges of science, the edge of scientific knowledge.
And we do feel sorry for Laika, for instance, who was sent up in Sputnik 2 with no ability to come back home.
Indeed, although she did come back home because she burnt up on the re-entry of Sputnik 2 in 1957. So, that spacecraft did circle the Earth, I think, for about 132 days, but it's believed she died in the first few hours, and they could register her heartbeat, and it went up 3 times, which, of course, it would do for anyone, let alone a poor dog that was sent up with no water and no supplies or anything else, and who was put through that unbelievable experience. So that was the first space disaster, if you like, 1957.
Well, when the Russians had decided to stop killing dogs, they started getting into trouble with their own cosmonauts. And in 1967, the Soyuz 1 crashed.
Yeah, that was Vladimir Komarov in 1967. And he was a complete pioneer, a very brave man, but the technical failure there was a parachute. That just didn't work, and so his spacecraft plunged back to Earth. And
that
he
was
killed.
The parachute that was last used in the Eiffel Tower, was it? Same one.
Yeah, same impact. Yeah, it probably the same shoddy workmanship.
And around the same time as the Soyuz 1 crashed, the Apollo series in the US had terrible difficulties with Apollo 1 in January 1967.
Yeah, there was the fire on the test stand that killed 3 of the crew, 3 crew members, and that was a catastrophe. But the Apollo program continued, and it was that mindset, the idea that you just push through all these problems and you just get on with it. And even with the space shuttle program, you're always, if you're pushing technology, if you're pushing the limits, you are going to get accidents.
There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
Everyone really remembers the Challenger disaster from 1986. Everyone remembers Ronald Reagan's speech. And that was something as simple as the O-rings. And it's always been said there was human error. The idea of launching in that cold weather, you were going to get those sorts of problems. You were going to get fuel leaks. You were going to get technical failure.
And there was not a cover-up, but they were trying to work out what had happened, but they were trying to find reasons for it to sort of go away. And it was the physicist Richard Feynman who really pushed the boat out, and they came up with a proper report, which
but there were
revealed O-rings.
But there were always technical problems. I mean, back in late 81, I was in the States and went across Florida to see a space shuttle launch, and 30 seconds before takeoff, the mission was aborted. And I'd bankrupted myself as a teenager, taking a cab across Florida to watch it. So
Jamie's great big space adventure.
That was the
a bit tragic.
That was
really.
the limit. but so this was sort of happening all the time. Then you move forward to 2003 and the Columbia disaster. That was a disaster coming back into the atmosphere. That was because what had happened was that insulation foam had come off and taken a tile off on the launch of the space shuttle, and so it was burnt up, and disintegrated, fell apart on re-entry. So, whether it's takeoff or re-entry, there are a myriad of problems that have to be dealt with.
But that, Jamie, is not the only space mission you've been on. Tell us your other space story.
Well, the nearest I've come to space story is meeting...
In 1 minute.
is meeting an astronaut, Jim Irwin. And he was on Apollo 15. He was the 8th man to walk on the moon in 1971 and found the Genesis rock, brought that back, which was a large piece of rock by the standards of the time, part of the moon's crust, I think about 4 billion years old. But his disaster came later on because he found God on the moon, and I remember him telling me that he had put his thumb up and blanked out the Earth and realized how fragile and beautiful the Earth was and how alone we were. It inspired him to become a born-again Christian, and he started taking expeditions and directing expeditions to Mount Ararat to find Noah's Ark, and he was deeply unsuccessful in that task because Noah's Ark was never there. He was plainly a Bible literalist and thought he would find the structure of Noah's Ark there, or the remains of it, and that was a failure. So in a way, his disastrous expeditions came later on rather than in space.
He was no Indiana Jones.
Well, he was a very good man and fascinating to talk to.
Should have stuck to space.
He should have stuck to space rather than to mountains.
So this is our postscript. There can be the odd triumph.
Yeah, Tom, I want to take you to the Andes, 1985, and that famous story of Joe Timpson and Simon Yates, that extraordinary struggle for survival, when they too were hit by rockfalls and problems and very difficult descent on the Sula Grande.
And terrible weather.
Terrible weather. Poor old Joe Timpson was on the end of the rope. They were making this sort of incremental descent and thought they were doing okay. And then Joe Timpson went over the side of a ledge, and the wind was terrible. And Simon Yates couldn't hear what was going on. And he was being pulled over the edge as well. And it would have been a fall of 150 feet, 200 feet. So he decided to cut the rope, and thought that Joe Simpson was killed, thought he had fallen down a crevasse, tried to find him when he got down, and there was no sign of him. So spent 3 days, I think it was, walking back to camp and managed to get back. But lo and behold, who should turn up but Joe Simpson, who managed to crawl and limp with a broken leg back from the crevasse that he had fallen down. He managed to lower himself down and find an exit. It was the most extraordinary.
From the crevasse.
From the crevasse. And all these people, they end up suffering from dehydration, fatigue. I mean, just the stress of it is absolutely extraordinary. But as we said at the start, mountaineers, climbers are a very different breed. And you have to be very committed.
And I seem to remember from that story the final insult as Joe Simpson comes into the camp, which is just about being packed up, but he gets there in time, is that he falls into their cesspit.
Yeah, so it should have been called Touching the Cloth rather than Touching the Void, I guess.
Don't touch your bottom.
But an amazing story. And there's that other story from 2003, which was Aaron Ralston, who was hiking and climbing in Utah and had a boulder land on his arm. And he's the one who was stuck for 127 hours and had to amputate his right forearm, broke the bones and amputated it with a blunt blade. I mean, it was just absolutely extraordinary. And he was suffering from dehydration, had to drink his own urine, loss of blood, in spite of the tourniquet. It was the most terrifying ordeal. So I'm not surprised he's now a motivational speaker, frankly. But 127 hours, that was about as long as it felt that the film took to watch. There's nothing more dull than a man in agony talking to and fighting a rock face. I didn't think it was such a great movie, I have to say.
Oh, well, then let's end on a low note.
Let's end on
there
a low
you
note.
have it, folks.
But there are always going to be extraordinary expeditions, and I have to give a shout out for the 1212 Children's Crusade, Tom, because there you had tens of thousands of children heading off into the unknown. It was the desire to find the true cross. It was a desire to reach for something that they didn't understand, heading into a land and an environment they had no conception of. That was a disastrous expedition, but that is really the bottom line. That is really the theme that runs through disastrous expeditions. Yes, you can have survivors. Yes, you can have amazing stories of heroism, but there are so many things that can go wrong, but whether it's through bad luck or through bad judgment.
101 ways to come undone in pursuit of the ultimate, for now, or latest prize.
Yeah, just do a podcast.
Jamie and I must now strap on our crampons and take Maggie to the park. Actually, we need to go to the cafe because we're starving. Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, Tom.
So it goes. You have been... So it goes. You have been listening to Bloody Violent History with Tom Ashton and James Jackson. You can email me at talk@bloodyviolenthistory.com. And remember to share this podcast with a friend. Thank you and good luck. Stop making that noise.